I didn't shout, I didn't argue. I just turned a valve, and their lake disappeared. The first thing I remember is the smell, burnt oak and melted plastic cutting through the cold night air like a warning I was too late to hear. I was halfway down my gravel drive, boots crunching under frost, when the orange glow hit the edge of my vision. By the time I reached the storage rack, everything I'd stacked for winter, cord after cord of seasoned firewood, sealed bins of dry food, months of preparation, was already collapsing into blackened ash. The heat pushed against my face, sharp and dry, while the last pieces of timber cracked and split like gunshots in the quiet. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, breathing in smoke and realizing someone hadn't just made a mistake, they'd made a decision. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 38, civil engineer, specialized in water control systems, dams, spillways, retention basins. The kind of work most people never think about until something goes wrong. I bought this property 3 years ago, just outside a manicured HOA development that cared more about mailbox colors than common sense. I kept to myself, built what I needed, prepared for winters the way my father taught me, quiet, methodical, ready. That stack of wood wasn't decoration. That food wasn't excess. That was survival, and someone had just erased it overnight. The next morning, the air still carried that bitter, chemical edge of something that shouldn't have burned. I found the notice pinned to what was left of my storage frame. Bright white paper against black ash. Hazardous material removal in compliance with community safety standards. No signature. No apology. Just a neat HOA header and a date stamped like it was routine maintenance. I could almost hear her voice reading it. Victoria Hale, HOA president. The kind of woman who smiled like she was doing you a favor while she tightened the rules around your throat. She'd been after me for months. Complaints about visual clutter, improper storage, non-compliant outdoor materials. She never said firewood. She said unsightly accumulation. She never said food supply. She said unauthorized storage units. I gave her documentation, permits, code references. She gave me silence, and then this. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my land wasn't just another plot on their map. It sat upstream of the retention system that fed their prized community lake. The same lake they advertised in glossy brochures. The same lake their property values depended on. And more importantly, a system I helped design before I ever bought this place. I crouched down, ran my hand through the ash, felt the fine grit coat my fingers like cold dust. No flames left. No heat. Just the aftermath. And in that silence, something clicked into place. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't file a complaint. I went inside, pulled up the original site plans, and found exactly what I was looking for. A secondary release channel. Overlooked. Legal. Untouched. I checked the timestamp on the notice again. 72 hours. That's how long it would take for everything to line up perfectly. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of water from down the hill. Their lake, still full, still calm, still reflecting a version of control they thought they had. I wiped the ash off my hands, slow and steady, and for the first time since the fire, I smiled just a little. Because they didn't destroy my winter. They triggered something much bigger. And this time, I wasn't going to stop it. By sunrise, the smoke was gone, but the smell stayed in the wood of the porch, in my jacket, in the back of my throat like something unfinished. I brewed coffee the same way I always did. Slow drip, no rush, but the sound of it hitting the glass carafe felt louder than usual in the quiet. Out past my fence line, I could already see movement on the paved road that led into the subdivision. Golf carts, morning walkers, people pretending nothing had happened while they kept their distance. That was the thing about this place. Problems did not get confronted. They got managed, packaged, filed away behind polite smiles and official letters. I sat down at my kitchen table with the original site plan spread out in front of me, paper edges worn from years of folding and unfolding. Every line on that map meant something. Elevation marks, flow direction, pressure tolerances. I traced the contour lines with my finger, feeling the slight indentation where ink had soaked into paper decades ago. The retention lake sat about 600 yards downhill from my property line, fed by a network of controlled channels designed to regulate runoff during heavy rain. Most people saw a calm surface of water with a walking trail around it. I saw a system balanced on numbers. Numbers I knew better than anyone in that neighborhood. I had helped calculate them. The secondary release channel was not on any of the HOA's promotional materials. It was not something you put on a brochure next to pictures of paddle boats and picnic benches. It was a failsafe, designed to protect upstream land in case of overload or structural stress. It was legal. It was documented. And more importantly, it fell under jurisdiction that the HOA could not override. I took a sip of coffee, bitter and hot, and opened my laptop. County records came up slow, the way they always did, but the documents were all there. Permits, easements, inspection reports signed off years before Victoria Hale ever held a board meeting. I printed what I needed, each page sliding out with a mechanical hum that felt steady, predictable, the opposite of everything that had happened the night before. Around mid-morning, a white SUV rolled past my driveway and slowed just enough for me to catch a glimpse through the tinted window. Victoria. Even from a distance, I recognized the posture, the way she held her head slightly tilted like she was always evaluating something. She did not stop. She did not wave. But she knew I was there, and I knew she was watching. That was fine. Let her watch. Because this was the part where most people reacted. Filed complaints. Made calls. Tried to argue their way back to fairness. I had done that before in other situations, and it always ended the same way. Time wasted. Energy drained. Nothing fixed. This time, I was not reacting. I was preparing. I walked out to the edge of my property where the ground sloped downward toward the tree line. The soil was still damp from last week's rain, boots sinking slightly with each step. Down below, I could hear it before I could see it. The low, steady movement of water through the channel, controlled but constant. That sound had always been background noise to me. Now it was a reminder. Systems did not care about opinions. They followed design. I crouched near the access panel, brushed away a thin layer of dirt and leaves, and exposed the metal cover beneath. The bolts were intact. No tampering. No interference. Of course not. They had focused on what they could see, what they could label and remove. They never thought to look at what was built into the land itself. I checked my watch. 70 hours left. Not that I was counting every minute. But timing mattered. Water levels. Usage patterns. And most importantly, the event I knew they would not cancel. The annual winter festival by the lake. Lights, music, families gathered along the shoreline they believed was permanent. I stood up, wiped my hands clean, and looked down the slope one more time. Everything was in place. Nothing rushed. Nothing forced. Just a system waiting to do exactly what it was designed to do. And for the first time since the fire, the air felt different. Still cold. Still sharp. But no longer empty. It carried something else now. Patience. The afternoon settled in with that thin winter light that never quite warms anything, just stretches shadows longer across the ground. I spent most of it outside, not fixing, not rebuilding, just walking the perimeter of what used to be mine to rely on. The rack was gone, reduced to warped metal and ash, but the concrete anchors were still there, 4 of them, spaced exactly the way I had measured them 2 summers ago. Solid. Unmoved. I brushed one clean with my boot and stood there for a second, listening. No wind. No birds. Just that distant, low hum of water moving through a system that did not stop for anyone. Around 2 in the afternoon, a pickup truck rolled up slow along the edge of my property and stopped just short of the fence line. It was Mark Delaney, one of the residents from the lower end near the lake. Retired, always polite, the kind of guy who nodded more than he talked. He killed the engine, but did not get out right away. When he finally opened the door, it creaked in the cold like it had something to say. Heard about what happened? He said, keeping his voice low, like the air itself might carry it back to the wrong ears. I nodded once. They call it cleanup now. He glanced past me at the blackened ground, then back down toward the subdivision. There is a meeting tonight. Emergency session. Something about safety enforcement. They are saying they had no choice. I let that sit between us for a second. No choice. That was always the phrase. Like decisions just appeared out of nowhere, and people had to follow them. You going? I asked. He shook his head. No. But you should know. They are planning to make an example out of this. Set a standard before the festival this weekend. Make sure nobody steps out of line. The festival. There it was again, like a clock ticking in the background. Lights strung around the lake. Food trucks lined up on the east side. Kids running along the shoreline where the water reflected everything back twice as bright. I had seen it last year from a distance. It looked perfect. Controlled. Exactly the kind of image Victoria Hale wanted tied to her name. Mark shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against gravel. Just thought you should hear it from someone who is not reading off a notice. I gave him a small nod. I appreciate that. He hesitated, then added, Be careful, Ethan. They are not used to being questioned. I almost smiled at that, but it did not quite reach my face. I am not planning to question anything. He looked at me for a moment longer, like he was trying to understand what I meant, then climbed back into his truck and drove off, tires crunching slower this time. I watched him disappear down the road before turning back toward the slope behind my house. The light was fading now, turning everything a shade darker, sharper. I walked the same path as before, boots finding the familiar dips in the ground without thinking. The access panel sat where I left it, metal surface catching the last bit of daylight. I knelt down again, not to open it, not yet, just to rest my hand on it. Cold, solid, reliable. Unlike people, systems did not pretend. They did exactly what they were designed to do, nothing more, nothing less. I checked my watch. 60 hours left. The number was smaller now, tighter, like everything was closing in on a single point. From down below, I could hear faint echoes of activity starting near the lake. Setup crews, maybe. The beginning of something they thought they controlled. I stood up slowly, letting the quiet settle back in around me. The smell of ash was still there, lighter now, but not gone. It would not be gone for a while. That was fine. Some things were not meant to disappear quickly. Some things were meant to remind you exactly where the line was crossed. And once that line was crossed, you did not argue about it. You did not negotiate. You let the system respond. The night air dropped fast, that kind of dry cold that settles into the ground and stays there, turning every step into a sharp crunch under your boots. I did not go to the meeting. I did not need to hear Victoria Hale stand in front of a room full of people and dress up what happened in cleaner words. I already knew how that would sound. Safety, compliance, community standards. Words that look harmless until you see what they leave behind. Instead, I stayed on my porch, lights off, watching the distant glow down the hill where the clubhouse sat near the lake. You could see the windows lit up, silhouettes moving behind glass, people shifting in their seats, nodding along to something they would not question out loud. Every now and then, a car would pass my driveway on its way down, tires humming softly against pavement, like nothing had changed. But something had changed. It just had not reached them yet. I pulled my jacket tighter and stepped down onto the gravel, the cold air cutting clean through the fabric. The smell of ash was fading, replaced by that faint metallic scent you get when temperature drops fast and moisture hangs low. I walked the path again, same route, same rhythm, like checking a piece of equipment before a long run. Down the slope, past the tree line, toward the access point that most people did not even know existed. The ground was firmer. Now, frost locking the top layer in place, each step steady, controlled. I reached the panel and crouched, brushing away a thin layer of ice crystals that had formed along the edges. The metal caught the moonlight just enough to show its outline, a quiet presence built into the land long before the first house went up. I rested my hand on it again, feeling that same solid resistance, the kind that does not shift under pressure. Behind me, somewhere down the hill, I could hear the meeting breaking up. Car doors closing, engine starting, voices carrying just far enough to remind you that people always move on quickly when they think something is settled. I checked my watch. 48 hours left. The number felt different now. Not just a countdown, but a sequence. Timing had to be right. The lake levels, the inflow rate, the expected usage during the festival. It all lined up in my head like it always did when I worked a project. Numbers did not lie. They did not justify. They simply existed. I stood up and walked a few steps further down until I could see the faint outline of the water through the trees. Even at night, the surface caught light from the houses around it, reflecting it back in soft ripples. Calm, controlled, exactly how they liked it. I stayed there for a minute, just listening. The low, steady movement of water feeding into the basin. The occasional splash from something shifting beneath the surface. It looked permanent. It always does, right up until it is not. I turned back toward the house, moving slower this time, letting the quiet settle in around me again. Halfway up the slope, headlights swept across the trees and then cut off. A car had stopped at the edge of my property. I did not need to get closer to know who it was. The door opened, and I heard the distinct click of heels against gravel, sharp and deliberate. Victoria did not call out. She did not need to. Her presence was always loud enough on its own. I stopped where I was and waited. She stayed near the fence line, just far enough to keep the distance official. "You should have come tonight," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, like nothing had ever been out of place. I did not answer right away. The cold air sat between us, heavy and still. Everything that needed to be said was already written down. I replied finally, keeping my tone level. She let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without warmth. "We are maintaining order, Mr. Caldwell. That is what keeps this community valuable." I glanced past her toward the lights down by the lake, then back at her. "Value depends on what you are measuring." She tilted her head slightly, studying me the way she always did, like she was trying to find a weakness she could document. "Just make sure you understand where you stand." There it was again, that quiet assumption that the ground beneath her was fixed, unquestionable. I nodded once, slow and steady. "I do." She held my gaze for a second longer, then turned and walked back to her car, heels clicking in a steady rhythm until the door shut and the engine started. The headlights swept across the slope one last time before disappearing down the road. I stood there until the sound faded completely, then looked back down toward the water. 48 hours. And for the first time, I was certain of one thing. She did not understand where she was standing. Morning came in quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over everything after a decision has already been made, even if no one else knows it yet. I stepped outside before sunrise, breath visible in the cold air, boots hitting the frozen ground with a dull, steady rhythm. The remains of the fire looked different in that early light, less dramatic, more final. Gray ash flattened against the earth, the last pieces of warped metal catching a pale reflection from the sky. No smoke, no heat, just absence. I did not linger there long. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to salvage. Whatever had been taken was already accounted for. I moved past it, down the familiar path toward the slope, each step measured, deliberate. The frost held firm underfoot, thin crystals breaking with a soft crackle that echoed just enough to remind me how quiet everything else was. When I reached the access panel, I paused, not out of hesitation, but out of habit. You do not interact with the system without acknowledging what it is capable of. I brushed away the frost, exposing the clean edge of the metal cover beneath. My reflection was faint, distorted, but it was there. I checked my watch. 24 hours left. The number sat heavy in my mind. Not rushed, not urgent, just exact. Down below, the lake carried a different sound now. More activity, more movement. The early stages of preparation for the festival were already underway. I could hear distant engines, equipment being unloaded, voices carrying in short bursts through the cold air. They were building something temporary on top of something they believed permanent. That contrast never fails. I stood there for a moment longer, listening, letting the rhythm of it settle in. Then I turned and walked back up toward the house. Around mid-morning, a second notice arrived. This one was placed directly on my front door, not pinned to debris, not left where it might be overlooked. Clean, official, deliberate. I opened it slowly, paper stiff in the cold. Final compliance warning. The wording was sharper this time, less dressed up, more direct. Immediate removal of all non-approved structures and materials. Continued monitoring. Possible legal escalation. The tone had shifted. Not concern, not community. Control. I read it once, then folded it neatly and set it on the kitchen counter next to the stack of documents I had already prepared. Permits, maps, signed approvals. Everything they had ignored. Everything that still held weight whether they acknowledged it or not. I poured another cup of coffee, the steam rising in thin lines that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. Outside, a truck pulled into the driveway without slowing, gravel shifting under its tires before it stopped near the edge of the yard. Two men stepped out, both wearing reflective vests, both carrying clipboards like they were part of something official. They did not approach the house right away. Instead, they walked toward the remains of the storage rack, pointing, writing, documenting. I watched from the window, not hidden, just present. After a few minutes, one of them looked up, noticed me, and gave a small, uncertain nod. I returned it, calm, steady. No confrontation. No words. They finished their notes and left as quietly as they had arrived. Documentation again. Always documentation. But documentation works both ways. By early afternoon, the sound from the lake had grown louder. Generators humming, speakers being tested, a low pulse of music cutting through the air in short bursts. I could almost map the layout in my head without seeing it. Stage near the east bank. Vendor tents along the walkway. Lighting strung across the water for reflection. All of it dependent on a single assumption, that the system beneath it would hold exactly as expected. I stepped back outside and looked down the slope, hands resting loosely at my sides. The cold air felt sharper now, cleaner, like the kind that comes just before something shifts. I checked my watch again. 12 hours. The sequence was almost complete, and for the first time since the fire, I did not feel the absence anymore. I felt alignment. Every piece where it needed to be. Every variable accounted for. They believed they had closed the situation, that they had defined the outcome. But they were only looking at the surface, and the surface was the least important part. By late afternoon, the sky turned that flat winter gray that makes everything feel closer than it is, like distance itself is shrinking in preparation for something. I stayed inside most of the day, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left outside that required my attention. Everything that mattered now was already in place. I spread the documents across the table one more time, not to double-check, but to confirm what I already knew. Easement rights, federal water oversight references, original engineering approvals with signatures that still carried weight no matter how many HOA meetings had happened since. I ran my hand over the paper edges, feeling the slight ridges where ink met fiber, grounding myself in something exact, something that did not shift with opinion. Around 4 o'clock, the first wave of festival traffic began to roll in. I could hear it before I saw it. Tires on pavement, doors closing, distant laughter carried thin through the cold air. It was a different kind of sound than the usual quiet of the neighborhood. Louder, more relaxed, like people stepping into a version of life they expected to hold steady. I stepped out onto the porch and watched the line of cars moving toward the lake, headlights cutting through the early dusk. Families bundled in jackets, kids running ahead, the low hum of music already starting to build from down the hill. It all looked normal, controlled, planned. I checked my watch. 6 hours. The number felt precise, like a measurement you trust without questioning. I walked back inside, grabbed my coat, and headed down the slope one more time. The path felt familiar now in a different way, not just routine, but final. Each step landed exactly where I expected it to. Each shift in the ground accounted for. When I reached the access panel, I did not hesitate. I knelt down, brushed away the thin layer of frost that had formed again, and set my hand on the metal surface. Cold, solid, predictable. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small tool I had brought. Simple, nothing complicated, just enough to do what needed to be done. The bolts loosened with a steady, controlled resistance, each turn quiet but firm, like opening something that had been waiting. I lifted the cover just enough to expose the mechanism beneath, the faint metallic smell rising up as the colder air met what had been sealed below. I did not activate anything yet. Timing mattered. Always. I replaced the cover, secured it loosely, and stood back up, brushing dirt from my hands. Down below, the lake was alive with movement now. Strings of lights stretched across the surface, reflecting in long, shimmering lines that made the water look deeper than it was. Music carried clearly, bass notes thumping in a slow, steady rhythm. People gathered along the edges, their voices blending into a constant murmur that rose and fell with the night. I could see the main stage set up on the east side, exactly where I expected it to be. Everything in its place. Everything depending on balance. I turned away and walked back up toward the house, not rushing, not slowing, just moving through the final steps of something already decided. Inside, I hung my coat, poured a glass of water, and stood by the window looking out over the slope. The cold pressed lightly against the glass, a thin barrier between two states that were about to shift. I checked my watch again. 2 hours. The sequence had narrowed to a single point. No adjustments left. No variables unaccounted for. Just execution. Outside, the music grew louder, the lights brighter, the illusion stronger. And beneath all of it, unseen, unchanged, the system waited. The last hour moved slower than the rest. Not because time changed, but because everything around it became sharper, more defined, like the world itself was narrowing down to a single moment. I stepped outside again, the cold hitting harder now, sinking through layers and settling into bone. The sky had cleared just enough for a few stars to break through, faint but steady, while down below the lake was fully alive. Music rolled up the slope in waves, bass thumping in a rhythm that matched the movement of people gathered along the shoreline. Laughter, conversation, the clink of bottles and cups, all blending into something that sounded permanent if you did not know better. I walked down the path one final time, each step deliberate, each breath measured. The frost had thickened, crunching louder underfoot, announcing movement in a place that usually stayed quiet after dark. But no one was looking up here. Their attention was down there, where the lights were brighter. When I reached the access panel, I did not pause this time. I knelt, brushed away the frost with the back of my hand, and loosened the bolts the rest of the way. The metal lifted smoothly, exposing the mechanism beneath, a compact assembly of valves and controls built for precision, not visibility. A faint hum came from within, the low vibration of water pressure held in balance, waiting for direction. I reached in and rested my hand on the control handle, cold metal against colder air, grounding, steady. For a second, I listened. Not to the music, not to the voices, but to the system itself. The subtle movement of water through channels, the quiet tension held in place by design. This was not destruction. This was release. I checked my watch. Exactly on time. I adjusted the handle slowly, feeling the resistance give in a controlled, measured way. Not forced, not rushed, just enough to begin. There was no dramatic sound, no sudden shift. Systems like this do not announce themselves. They respond. I secured the panel loosely again, leaving everything accessible but contained, then stood up and stepped back. From this distance, nothing had changed. The lake still reflected the lights, still carried the sound of music and movement across its surface. But beneath that surface, the balance had already begun to shift. I walked up the slope, not looking back right away. There was no need to watch every second. I knew exactly how it would unfold. Time, flow rate, pressure difference. It was all calculated long before this moment. Halfway up, I stopped and turned. At first, it was subtle. A slight change in the way the reflections moved, the lines of light stretching differently across the water. Then, slowly, the edge of the shoreline began to reveal itself, dark earth appearing where water had been just minutes before. The music did not stop immediately. People do not notice change when it happens gradually. They adjust. They explain it away. But the system does not care about perception. It continues. The hum of generators, the pulse of speakers, the rhythm of a night built on assumptions, all continued as the water level dropped inch by inch. I stood there, hands at my sides, breathing steady, watching something precise unfold exactly as designed. No chaos, no panic, just a process completing itself. Down below, a few voices started to shift in tone, confusion threading through conversation as the shoreline crept further out. Lights reflected differently now, broken by uneven ground emerging beneath. The illusion was thinning. I checked my watch one more time, not out of necessity, but out of habit, right on schedule. And for the first time since the fire, the balance felt restored. Not because something was taken, but because something had been corrected. It did not collapse all at once. That was the part most people did not expect. The water did not disappear like a switch being flipped. It lowered with quiet precision, inch by inch, revealing the truth underneath in a way no one could ignore once they saw it. From the slope, I watched the shoreline pull back steadily, exposing dark, damp earth that had not seen open air in years. The reflections of string lights stretched longer, distorted now, broken by uneven ground where smooth water had been just minutes before. Down below, the shift in sound came next. Music still played, but it no longer carried the same weight. Conversations changed tone, laughter cutting shorter, voices rising just enough to question what they were seeing. People moved closer to the edge, drawn by something they could not immediately explain. A few stepped down where the water had been, shoes pressing into soft ground, testing it like it might somehow reverse if they waited long enough. It did not. Systems do not reverse without cause. They follow direction. I stayed where I was, not hidden, not exposed, just positioned where I could see the entire sequence unfold. The generators continued to hum, lights still glowing bright against a surface that was no longer there to hold them properly. The illusion had not shattered in a single moment. It was dissolving in real time, and that made it harder to deny. I could see movement near the main stage now, people gesturing toward the waterline, pointing, calling others over. The rhythm of the night was breaking, piece by piece, replaced by uncertainty. Not chaos, not panic, just the slow realization that something fundamental was changing. I checked my watch. Exactly where it needed to be. The flow rate was holding steady, the system releasing water at a controlled pace, never exceeding what it was designed to handle. This was not damage. This was compliance with a condition they had created without understanding it. A few more feet of shoreline emerged, revealing rocks, old debris, things that had settled over time beneath a surface no one questioned. The lake was not disappearing. It was being shown for what it was beneath the surface they relied on. I took a slow breath, the cold air sharp in my lungs, and let it out evenly. Down below, I could see a small group forming near the center walkway, their attention shifting from celebration to concern. Phones came out. Lights moved. The sound system cut for a moment, then came back lower, like someone was unsure whether to continue or stop entirely. That hesitation said more than any announcement could. Halfway through the process, the change was undeniable. The waterline had dropped enough that the visual balance was gone. What had looked like a polished, reflective centerpiece now looked uneven, exposed, incomplete. The kind of thing that does not belong in a brochure. I turned slightly, adjusting my view to take in the full scene, from the top of the slope down to the edge where people now stood in clusters, trying to understand something that did not fit their expectations. And through it all, the system continued, steady, quiet, indifferent to reaction. Because it was never about reaction. It was about response. And the response had already begun the moment they decided to act without understanding what they were connected to. I checked my watch one more time, not out of concern, but confirmation. Everything was aligned. Every variable accounted for. And down below, the lake they believed defined their control was steadily revealing that it had never belonged to them in the way they thought. By the time the water level reached the midpoint of the basin, the night had changed completely. The music had stopped, not with a dramatic cut, but with that slow fade that happens when someone realizes the moment no longer fits the setting. Lights still hung above the exposed ground, glowing against surfaces they were never meant to illuminate, stretching reflections across mud instead of water. The shoreline had doubled in width, and what used to be a clean edge was now a layered gradient of damp earth, scattered stones, and things that had been hidden for years. People stood in clusters, their movements smaller now, voices lower, attention fixed on something they could no longer explain away. I stayed on the slope, watching it all settle into its final shape. The system did not rush. It never does. It completed its process with the same steady precision it began with, releasing exactly what it was designed to release, no more, no less. Within another hour, the lake was no longer a lake in the way they understood it. What remained was a shallow stretch of water at the far end, disconnected from the image they had built around it. The centerpiece of their community had become something else entirely, something real, something exposed. Headlights began to move again, cars pulling away earlier than planned, tires tracing new paths around ground that had not been there before. The festival ended not with an announcement, but with a quiet unraveling. I turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the scene behind without needing to see every second of the conclusion. I already knew how it would finish. Inside, the air felt warmer, still carrying that faint trace of smoke that had started everything. I set my keys down on the counter, poured a glass of water, and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence that had replaced the distant music. It was a different kind of quiet now. Not empty. Resolved. The next morning came with a heavier sky, low clouds pressing down over the entire area. I stepped outside and looked down the slope again. The lake was still reduced, the exposed ground darker now, marked by footprints and tire tracks from the night before. Equipment sat idle near the edge, abandoned mid-use, as if no one had been ready for the process to continue beyond their control. Around mid-morning, a black SUV pulled into my driveway and stopped without hesitation. Victoria stepped out, her posture the same, controlled, composed, but something in her expression had shifted. Not panic, not anger. Calculation adjusting to a new reality. She walked up to the porch, stopping just short of the steps. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice even, but thinner than before. I did not answer right away. I let the question sit in the air, the same way her notice had sat on my door. "I followed the system," I said finally, keeping my tone steady. She glanced past me toward the slope, then back again. "You interfered with community property." I shook my head once. "I operated within a documented release channel tied to my land. The same land your board authorized intervention on 3 days ago." Her jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack in the control she carried so carefully. "This will be addressed," she said. I nodded. "It already is." She held my gaze for a second longer, then turned without another word and walked back to her vehicle. No threats, no raised voice, just the quiet understanding that the balance had shifted. I watched her leave, then looked down toward the exposed basin one more time. The lines were clear now. Cause and response. Action and consequence. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing hidden. I stepped back inside, closed the door, and let the latch click into place with a soft, final sound. Because in the end, I did not take anything from them. I just let the system show them exactly what they were standing on.